My daughter destroyed her sister's college interview, and it probably saved her life. My oldest daughter, Jessica, came flying down the stairs screaming, "Why did my interviewer just call and cancel?" I asked her what she was talking about, and she said through tears. She said they're throwing out my application because of a morality clause? Because they think I'm pregnant with my teacher's baby? My younger daughter, Georgia, just said calmly, "That's because I just called and told her you were pregnant with Mr. Davidson's baby." Jessica's best friend, Ashley, who practically lived at our house, jumped up from her usual spot on our couch. "You psychotic little brat. You've always been jealous of your sister." I dropped my coffee mug and it shattered on the floor. "Georgia, what did you do?" "She can't drive to that interview," Georgia said, not even looking up from her bowl while Jessica sobbed that her entire future was ruined. Ashley grabbed Georgia's shoulder hard enough to make her wince. "This is what you do because Jessica's special and you're nobody? You destroy her life with some sick lie?" My husband ran in from the garage with grease still on his hands. When I told him what Georgia had done, his face went dark and that vein in his temple started pulsing. "Georgia, go to your room. Now." "Dad, look at Jessica. She can't even stand straight." "Because she's devastated, you monster," Ashley said, her voice getting shriller. "Anyone would be falling apart after what you just did." But I was looking at Jessica now. She was gripping the wall with both hands, and her carefully applied makeup was already smearing from tears. Her pupils were tiny pinpoints, and she kept swaying even though she was holding on. "Jessica, sweetheart, are you okay?" I asked, moving closer. "I'm fine," she said, but the words came out thick and slurred. "I just need to drive there and explain in person. Where are my keys?" She tried to walk to the key hook but stumbled hard into the counter. The sound of her hip hitting the granite made me flinch. My husband caught her arm before she went down completely. "It's a 45-minute highway drive," Georgia said. "She took a handful of pills 20 minutes ago. I saw Ashley give them to her upstairs." Ashley's face went from pale to red in seconds. "That's a complete lie. Georgia's been making up stories about me for months. First she said I'm a thief, then she said I'm helping Jessica cheat. Now I'm some kind of dealer?" Jessica tried to focus on us, but her eyes kept rolling back. "I just needed confidence. Big interview day. Ashley said they'd help." "What did you take?" my husband demanded, still holding her up. "Nothing harmful," Ashley answered quickly before Jessica could speak. "Maybe some Advil for her headache. Georgia's trying to cover for what she did by inventing drama." "I saw you crushing pills in her room," Georgia said, standing up from the table. "I had to make sure she didn't go to her interview." My husband was trying to get Jessica to look at him, but her head kept drooping forward. "Jessica, what did Ashley give you?" "Just some Xanax," Jessica mumbled, her words running together. "And the other ones, the good ones from Ashley's friend at the university." Ashley stepped between us and Jessica. "Those were prescribed. For anxiety. Lots of students take them for big moments. She's fine, just nervous." "She can barely stand," I said, watching my daughter slide slowly down despite my husband's grip on her arm. "That's because she just had her future destroyed," Ashley shot back, but sweat was visible on her forehead now. "You're really going to believe a jealous 13-year-old over me? I've been Jessica's best friend for 3 years." "That's not even the whole reason I had to stop you," Georgia said, and we all turned to look at her. She was holding Ashley's phone. Ashley left this on Jessica's bed when she was crushing the pills. She has texts to her dealer boyfriend from last night. Ashley lunged for the phone, but my husband blocked her. "That's private property. You can't look at that." Georgia read from the screen. Ashley wrote, "Giving Jay the special batch tomorrow morning. She won't make it to the highway." And he wrote back, "You sure you want to do this?" And Ashley said, "She dies before college or I'm screwed. Her dad will find out I've been stealing from her college fund." Jessica's legs gave out completely, and my husband had to lower her to the floor. She was trying to say something about her interview being at 11, but the words were incomprehensible. "Look at her," Georgia said, tears streaming down her face now. "She would have crashed on Route 95, but not by accident. Ashley gave her enough to kill her. That's why I had to call the college. I knew you wouldn't believe me about the pills in time. I had to make sure she couldn't leave." Ashley was backing toward the door, her purse clutched against her chest. "This is insane. You're all overreacting. She just took something for confidence like everyone does." "Everyone doesn't collapse on their kitchen floor," my husband said, pulling out his phone. "What exactly did you give her?" "I don't have to stand here and be interrogated," Ashley said, her hand on the doorknob. "Jessica wanted those pills. She asked for them. She knew what they were." My husband was talking to 911, giving our address while I tried to keep Jessica's head up. Her breathing was shallow and she wasn't responding to her name anymore no matter how much we screamed. The front door crashed open so hard it bounced off the wall and 2 paramedics rushed in with their equipment bags. I pointed at Jessica on the floor, and the woman paramedic dropped to her knees beside my daughter, while her partner started pulling out medical supplies. "She's not responding and she took pills," I said while my hands shook, so bad I could barely point. The woman checked Jessica's pulse at her neck, and then pulled her eyelid up to shine a light in her eye. "I'm Lindsay McManus, and we need to know exactly what she took," she said while her partner was already setting up some kind of machine. "Xanax and something else. Her friend gave them to her. I managed to get out." Lindsay's face got tight as she started an IV in Jessica's arm with movements so fast I could barely follow them. "How many pills and how long ago?" she asked while taping the needle in place. "I don't know how many, but maybe 30 minutes ago," I said. Lindsay grabbed her radio and started talking in medical terms I didn't understand, but I heard her say teenage overdose and possible benzo and opioid mix. Her partner was putting sticky patches on Jessica's chest and hooking them to a machine that started beeping. They lifted Jessica onto a stretcher like she weighed nothing, and I grabbed my purse to follow them out. "I'm riding with her," I said, and Lindsay nodded while they wheeled Jessica toward the ambulance. Daniel grabbed George's hand and said they'd follow in the car while I climbed into the back of the ambulance. The ambulance started moving, and I had to grab a rail as we took a sharp turn onto the main road. Lindsay was adjusting the IV drip and checking Jessica's blood pressure while the machine kept beeping with her heartbeat. Every bump in the road made me think about Jessica driving on Route 95 in this condition, and my stomach twisted. The siren was so loud I could feel it in my chest, and I held Jessica's hand even though she couldn't squeeze back. Lindsay kept checking her watch and writing things on a clipboard attached to the wall. We hit another bump, and the whole ambulance rocked, but Lindsay never stopped working on Jessica. The hospital came into view, and we pulled up to the emergency entrance where people in scrubs were already waiting. They pulled Jessica's stretcher out and rushed her through the automatic doors while I had to stop at the desk. The woman behind the glass slid a clipboard through the slot and started asking about insurance while Jessica disappeared down the hallway. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely write Jessica's name on the forms. "Does she have any allergies to medications?" the woman asked. "No, I don't think so," I said, while trying to remember if Jessica had ever had surgery before. "Any previous hospitalizations?" she asked, and I shook my head. Daniel and Georgia came through the doors, and Georgia immediately grabbed my arm with both hands. "Where's Jessica?" Daniel asked, and I pointed down the hall where they'd taken her. "They're working on her," I said, and Georgia's grip on my arm got tighter. The woman behind the desk kept asking questions about Jessica's birthday and our address, and I kept messing up the zip code. Finally, she took the clipboard back and told us to sit in the waiting area. We found plastic chairs near the TV that was playing some cooking show nobody was watching. Georgia wouldn't let go of my arm, and Daniel kept checking his phone like maybe someone would text him that Jessica was okay. Other people in the waiting room were holding ice packs to injuries or coughing into tissues, but we just sat there frozen. After what felt like forever but was probably an hour, a doctor in green scrubs came through the double doors. "Porter family?" he called, and we all jumped up. "Jessica's stable," he said, and I felt my legs get weak with relief. "We're running tests to identify exactly what's in her system, but we've given her medication to counteract the overdose." He said the combination of drugs could have been fatal if we'd waited even 30 minutes more to call for help. "Can we see her?" I asked, but he shook his head. "Not yet. She's still unconscious, but her vital signs are improving," he said. Georgia started crying for the first time all morning, and I pulled her against my side. The doctor said they'd update us when the blood work came back, and then he went back through the doors. We sat back down, and Daniel held my hand while Georgia leaned against my shoulder. "Jessica's taking pills right before her biggest interview? That timing seems really odd to me. Why would Ashley pick today of all days to give her something dangerous?" Georgia watching them crush pills upstairs but waiting until now to say anything makes me wonder what. About 20 minutes later, a man in a gray suit walked up to us. "I'm Detective Jerome Harrell," he said, and showed us his badge. "I need to ask you about what happened this morning." Daniel pulled Ashley's phone out of his pocket along with his own phone. "I took screenshots of these messages before we left the house," he said, and handed both phones to the detective. The detective's face got darker as he read through the text about the special batch and Ashley saying Jessica had to die before college. "This is evidence of premeditation," he said, and put both phones in evidence bags from his pocket. My phone started ringing, and I saw it was the college calling back. I left them a voicemail about why Jessica missed her interview, I told the detective before answering. The admissions officer sounded shocked when I explained that the pregnancy story was a lie Georgia told to save her sister's life. "We'll need documentation from the hospital about the medical emergency," she said, "but given the circumstances, we can put Jessica's application on hold rather than rejecting it." I thanked her and hung up while the detective was writing in his notebook. "I need to know exactly what your younger daughter saw this morning," Detective Harrell said, and turned to Georgia. Georgia wiped her face and took a deep breath. "I saw Ashley in Jessica's room crushing pills with the bottom of a glass," she said. "She mixed them into Jessica's smoothie that was on the dresser, and I was watching from the hallway, but she didn't see me." Her voice stayed steady, but she was squeezing my hand so hard my fingers went numb. "Ashley's been giving Jessica pills for weeks, saying they were for test anxiety, but this morning was different because she used way more." The detective wrote everything down and asked what time this happened. "Around 7:30, Georgia said. "Jessica always has a smoothie before big events, and Ashley knew that." Daniel cleared his throat and looked at the detective. "Our college savings account has been getting smaller," he said. "I thought it was just normal expenses, but maybe we should check if Ashley had access." The detective made another note and said they'd subpoena bank records as part of the investigation. "How long has Ashley been close to your family?" he asked. 3 years, I said, and felt sick thinking about all the times she'd eaten dinner with us. A woman with a hospital ID badge walked up to our group. "I'm Nyla Gibson, the hospital social worker," she said. "I'd like to speak with Georgia if that's okay." We all looked at Georgia, who nodded. Nyla sat down next to her and spoke in a gentle voice. "What you did today was incredibly brave," she said. "You saved your sister's life by thinking quickly in a scary situation." Georgia looked at the floor and said she thought everyone would be mad at her for lying. "Sometimes we have to do something wrong to prevent something worse," Nyla said. "You showed amazing judgment for someone your age." Georgia finally looked up, and the fear that had been on her face all morning started to fade. The detective stood up and said he had enough to arrest Ashley immediately. "We'll be in touch about the investigation," he said, and gave Daniel his card. We sat in those plastic chairs for another 2 hours waiting for news about Jessica, while the cooking show turned into a game show nobody watched either. The detective walked back through the sliding doors around 3 o'clock with his notebook out, and his face looking tired but satisfied. He pulled us aside from the other families waiting, and told us they'd picked up Ashley at her house with a suitcase half-packed, and her passport on the bed. She was telling the cops the phone wasn't hers, and that Georgia made everything up because she was jealous of Jessica's success. Detective Harrell said this was typical behavior for someone caught red-handed, and that we shouldn't worry because the text messages were clear evidence. Daniel squeezed my hand so hard I heard my knuckles crack while Georgia stared at the floor tiles and counted them over and over. Around dinner time, a nurse came out and said Jessica was awake and asking for us. We practically ran down the hallway and found her propped up in bed with an IV in her arm and monitors beeping around her. Her eyes were still glassy, but she recognized us and started crying the second she saw Georgia. I sat on the edge of her bed and explained what happened as gently as I could while she gripped my hand. She kept asking how Ashley could do this to her and saying they'd been best friends since freshman year. The betrayal in her voice made my chest hurt, and I watched Georgia climb onto the other side of the bed and curl up next to her sister. The doctor came in holding a clipboard and asked to speak with Daniel and me in the hallway. He showed us the toxicology report, which listed benzodiazepines and opioids in amounts that made his forehead wrinkle with concern. He explained that the dosage was definitely enough to cause a fatal car accident on the highway, and possibly enough to kill her outright if her metabolism was slower. Daniel's face turned red, and he punched the wall hard enough to leave a dent before storming off toward the bathroom. That evening, while I was helping Jessica sip some water, my phone rang with the school's number. The principal said rumors were already spreading through social media and parent group chats about what happened. He wanted to meet with us tomorrow to discuss damage control, especially about Georgia's false pregnancy claim regarding Mr. Davidson. I told him I was too exhausted to even think about school politics right now, and hung up. Detective Harrell called Daniel's phone an hour later with an update. They'd identified Ashley's boyfriend from the text messages as Chase Tanner, who they'd been watching for months. He'd been selling pills to college students, and this gave them enough for an arrest warrant. The detective said they expected to have him in custody by morning, which was the first good news we'd heard all day. We spent the night taking turns sleeping in the uncomfortable chair next to Jessica's bed. The next morning, Jessica was more alert, and the first thing she asked about was her college interview. I called the admissions office and explained the medical emergency without going into too many details. The woman on the phone said they could reschedule, but warned that the scholarship deadline was next week, and missing it meant losing the opportunity. Jessica started crying again when I told her, but at least the door wasn't completely closed. Around noon, we heard a knock, and Mr. Davidson walked in carrying a small plant. I tensed up, expecting him to be angry about the false accusation, but his face was kind and understanding. He said the principal had explained everything, and he completely understood why Georgia did what she did. He told Georgia she'd shown incredible bravery, and he'd write a statement for the police supporting her if needed. Georgia hugged him so hard he almost dropped the plant, and I saw her shoulders shaking with relief. Daniel's phone rang while Mr. Davidson was leaving, and it was the bank investigator he'd called yesterday. The investigator said they'd found unauthorized withdrawals going back 18 months, all matching dates when Ashley was at our house. Several transfers went to accounts traced back to Ashley and Chase, and the total stolen was almost $8,000. Daniel had to sit down when he heard the amount, and I watched his knuckles turn white as he gripped the phone. 2 days later, we met with Prosecutor Alina Vasquez in a small conference room at the courthouse. She spread out papers showing the charges she was filing, including attempted murder, theft, and conspiracy. She explained that Ashley had just turned 18, which meant she'd be tried as an adult, but it might affect sentencing. She asked if we were prepared for a long legal process that could take months or even a year. We all nodded, even though the thought of dragging this out made me feel sick. The next morning, Alina called to tell us Ashley's parents had hired Rick Shepard as her defense attorney. He was already pushing for a plea deal, claiming Ashley was manipulated by her older boyfriend and didn't understand the consequences. Alina said this was standard defense strategy and not to worry because the evidence was overwhelming. She said Ashley would probably try to paint herself as a victim, but the premeditated texts would be hard to explain away. We spent the rest of the week going back and forth between the hospital and home trying to keep some sense of normal life. Georgia went back to the school but came home early twice because kids kept asking her about the rumors. Jessica was discharged after 5 days with a bag of pamphlets about substance abuse, even though she kept explaining she didn't knowingly take anything dangerous. The house felt different without Ashley's constant presence, and we kept finding her things everywhere, like reminders of how blind we'd been. The panic attack started that same night when Jessica woke up screaming and clutching her chest. She was gasping for air and her whole body was shaking so hard the bed frame rattled against the wall. Daniel ran to get her a paper bag to breathe into while I held her and tried to calm her down, but nothing worked. Her eyes were wild and she kept saying she couldn't breathe even though she was taking huge gulps of air. We ended up calling the hospital and they told us to bring her back to the ER immediately. The psychiatrist on call examined her for 2 hours and diagnosed her with severe PTSD from the near-death experience. He wrote prescriptions for 3 different medications and said she'd need intensive outpatient therapy starting immediately with sessions 3 times a week minimum. The discharge nurse gave us a thick folder of information about monitoring Jessica for any lingering effects from the drug overdose, including potential liver damage and cognitive issues. Detective Harrell's timing was perfect. Nothing says good morning, like evidence bags and attempted murder charges while everyone's still processing their hospital coffee. Ashley went from bestie to booking in record time, though her "the phone's not mine" defense. Meanwhile, Georgia was having her own problems at the school where the rumors had spread like wildfire. Some kids came up to her calling her a hero for saving her sister's life, but others whispered that she was a snitch who got Ashley arrested. 2 girls from her science class stopped talking to her completely and moved to different lab tables. Her teacher pulled me aside during pickup to say Georgia seemed withdrawn and wasn't participating in class discussions anymore. I called the school counselor that afternoon and scheduled an appointment for Georgia to talk about handling the social pressure. The counselor said this kind of situation was unprecedented at their school and she'd need to research the best approach. That evening, Detective Harrell called with major news about the case. Chase had been arrested at a bus station trying to leave the state with a backpack full of drugs and cash. The police searched his phone and found dozens of texts between him and Ashley planning Jessica's death. Ashley had specifically asked him for something that would look like an accidental overdose if Jessica crashed her car on the highway. She'd been planning this for weeks and even researched which drug combinations would be most lethal but hardest to trace. The detective said the premeditation was now undeniable, and the prosecutor would definitely pursue attempted murder charges. After the kids went to bed, Daniel and I finally had the conversation we'd been avoiding about the money. He sat at the kitchen table with our bank statements spread out and admitted he'd noticed withdrawals he couldn't explain for months. He thought maybe I was taking cash out for household expenses and didn't want to question it since I handled most of the day-to-day finances. I told him I'd assumed he was using the ATM more often for work lunches or gas. We both felt sick realizing how Ashley had played us against each other while stealing thousands of dollars. Daniel's hands were shaking as he circled transaction after transaction that matched days Ashley had been at our house. The guilt of missing such obvious signs made us both feel like terrible parents who'd failed to protect our daughters. 3 days later, Jessica's official discharge day arrived, but she had a complete meltdown at the thought of going home. She said everything in the house reminded her of Ashley, and she couldn't stop seeing her supposed best friend crushing pills in her room. We called Daniel's sister, who lived an hour away, and she immediately agreed to let Jessica stay with her for a while. We spent the entire day packing up Jessica's room and removing every trace of Ashley from the house. Photo albums full of their sleepovers and birthday parties went into boxes in the attic. The friendship bracelet Ashley made Jessica for her 16th birthday got thrown in the trash along with concert tickets they'd saved and inside jokes written on sticky notes. Every item felt like another betrayal we'd been too blind to see. Georgia helped us pack and kept finding more of Ashley's things hidden in weird places like behind books on the shelf or stuffed in the back of drawers. The next week, the principal called an all-school assembly about drug abuse and the importance of speaking up when something seems wrong. He didn't use any names, but everyone knew exactly what situation he was talking about since the whole town had heard about Ashley's arrest. Georgia texted me from the auditorium that everyone was staring at her and whispering. She said she felt like she was going to throw up and asked if I could pick her up early. I drove to the school immediately and found her hiding in the bathroom crying. The principal apologized when I signed her out early, but said he felt the assembly was necessary for student safety. 2 weeks after the arrest, we had to go to the courthouse for Ashley's arraignment. Seeing her in orange jail clothes with her hands cuffed was surreal after all the time she'd eaten dinner with our family. Her hair was greasy and pulled back in a messy ponytail instead of the perfect styles she usually wore. She kept her eyes down the entire time and wouldn't look at any of us sitting in the gallery. Her lawyer did all the talking and entered a not guilty plea to all charges, including attempted murder and grand theft. The judge set bail at $500,000, which Ashley's parents couldn't afford, so she'd stay in jail until trial. We left the courthouse feeling empty rather than vindicated. The next day brought the first good news we'd had in weeks when the admissions officer from Jessica's dream college called. She said the admissions committee had reviewed the situation and decided to defer Jessica's acceptance to next year, given the extraordinary circumstances. The scholarship was gone since it couldn't be deferred, but at least Jessica would still have a spot if she wanted it. Jessica cried with relief when I told her and said maybe she'd be ready to try again after a year of therapy. Then the insurance company called and crushed that moment of hope by saying they wouldn't cover Jessica's therapy bills. They claimed the overdose was intentional self-harm, even though we explained Jessica didn't know what she was taking. The representative said their policy specifically excluded coverage for drug-related incidents regardless of circumstances. We started the appeals process, but the therapy bills were already piling up at $300 per session. Daniel picked up extra weekend shifts at the warehouse to help cover the costs while I took on freelance work in the evenings. Money became a constant source of stress on top of everything else we were dealing with. That Saturday night, Georgia completely broke down sobbing in her room. She kept saying she'd ruined everything by lying about the pregnancy, and now the whole family was suffering because of her. Her whole body shook as she cried that she was a terrible person who destroyed an innocent teacher's reputation. I held her tight and explained over and over that she'd saved Jessica's life, and that lying to prevent murder wasn't really lying at all. She wouldn't believe me until Jessica came home from her therapy session and hugged Georgia tight. Jessica told her sister she was the bravest person she knew, and that she'd be dead without Georgia's quick thinking. They cried together for an hour, while I watched my daughters finally start to heal from this nightmare. 2 days later, Alina called while I was doing laundry, and her voice had that careful tone that meant bad news was coming. She explained that Ashley's lawyer, Rick, was pushing hard for a deal where Ashley would plead guilty to assault and theft, but they'd drop the attempted murder charge completely. I dropped the basket of clean clothes on the floor and asked her what she thought we should do. She said the evidence for attempted murder was rock solid with the texts and the diary and Chase's testimony all backing it up. She strongly recommended we reject the deal and fight for the maximum charges because Ashley had clearly planned to kill Jessica and almost succeeded. Daniel came in from the garage when he heard me on the phone, and I put it on speaker so he could hear Alina explaining that taking the deal would mean Ashley could be out in maybe 2 years instead of the 12 we were hoping for. We looked at each other and both said no at the same time because 2 years wasn't enough for trying to murder our daughter. Alina said she'd tell Rick we weren't interested in any deal that didn't include the attempted murder charge, and she'd keep pushing for trial. Jessica started her outpatient therapy that week, going 3 times a week to a therapist who specialized in trauma and betrayal. The first few sessions left her exhausted, and she'd come home and go straight to bed without eating dinner. Her therapist warned us it could take years for Jessica to fully trust people again after someone so close had tried to kill her. Some days Jessica seemed almost normal and would laugh at TV shows or help with dinner, but other days she wouldn't get out of bed at all, and we'd hear her crying through the door. I started keeping a journal of her good days and bad days, trying to see if there was a pattern, but it seemed completely random when the darkness would hit her. The therapist said this was normal for someone processing such a deep betrayal, and we just had to be patient and supportive. 3 weeks into therapy, Alina called again with interesting news about Chase wanting to make a deal. His lawyer had approached her about Chase testifying against Ashley in exchange for reduced charges on his drug dealing. Chase was claiming Ashley was the mastermind who planned everything, and he just supplied the drugs without knowing her real plan to kill Jessica. Alina said his testimony could seal the case against Ashley because he had texts and recordings of her talking about the murder for weeks before she did it. She thought we should agree to the deal even though it meant Chase would get less time because nailing Ashley for attempted murder was the priority. Daniel was angry that Chase would get off easy, but I pointed out that Ashley was the one who actually drugged Jessica, and Chase's testimony would make sure she couldn't wiggle out of it. We told Alina to take the deal if it guaranteed Chase would testify about Ashley's planning. That same week, I was going through Jessica's room looking for her birth certificate for some paperwork when I found a box of mail under her bed that she'd never seen. There were 3 scholarship offer letters from different colleges that had arrived over the past 6 months, all unopened. I sat on her bedroom floor staring at these letters, realizing Ashley had been stealing Jessica's mail and hiding it from her. One scholarship was for $10,000 that Jessica could have really used, but the deadline had passed months ago. When I showed Jessica the letters, she broke down completely because she'd been wondering why she hadn't heard back from these schools. Chase was just supplying drugs without knowing the real plan? That's quite a story he's telling now that he's facing serious charges. Those texts between him and Ashley seem to tell a different version, though. We realized Ashley had been systematically sabotaging Jessica's future while pretending to be her supportive best friend helping with applications. The depth of the betrayal kept revealing new layers that made us all feel sick. I called the colleges to explain what had happened, but they said the deadlines were firm and the money had already been given to other students. Georgia finally went back to the school after a week at home, but it was rough from the start. Other kids whispered when she walked by, and some parents actually pulled their children away from her at pickup. The principal called me in to say some parents were concerned about having their kids around the girl who lies about teachers, because they didn't understand the full context of what had happened. One mother actually confronted me in the parking lot saying Georgia was a bad influence and asking if she'd been punished for lying about Mr. Davidson being inappropriate with Jessica. I wanted to scream at her that Georgia had saved Jessica's life, but I just walked away because these people wouldn't understand anyway. Georgia came home crying most days, saying nobody would sit with her at lunch and even her friends were avoiding her. I had to fight the urge to march into that school and confront every judgmental parent who was making my hero daughter feel like a villain. Detective Harrell called that Friday with huge news about finding Ashley's diary in her room during a second search. He said it detailed her resentment of Jessica's success and her growing desperation as she realized the college fund theft was about to be discovered when Jessica left for school. The entries from the last month showed clear planning for the murder attempt, including researching drug combinations and calculating doses. One entry from 2 weeks before the attempt said, "Jay has to die before graduation or I'm going to prison for theft," which was basically a written confession. The detective said this was the best evidence yet, and would make it almost impossible for Ashley to claim it was a spur-of-the-moment mistake. He was sending copies to the prosecutor immediately, and thought this would end any chance of a plea deal for anything less than attempted murder. Daniel installed security cameras around our house that weekend after we started getting hang-up calls at all hours. We couldn't prove they were from Ashley's friends, but who else would call and breathe into the phone before hanging up? The cameras covered the front door and driveway and the backyard, and Daniel put up signs saying we had surveillance. We all felt constantly on edge, and I found myself checking the locks multiple times before bed. Jessica wouldn't go outside alone anymore, and Georgia started sleeping in Jessica's room because she was having nightmares. Our home that used to feel safe now felt like a fortress we were defending against invisible enemies. Even the mail delivery made us nervous, and Daniel started checking it wearing gloves in case someone sent something dangerous. Despite her anxiety, Jessica decided she wanted to testify at Ashley's trial whenever it happened. Her therapist started helping her prepare by practicing staying calm while recounting traumatic events. They did exercises where Jessica would tell the story of that morning over and over until she could get through it without breaking down. She was determined to look Ashley in the eye and make sure the jury understood exactly what Ashley had done to her. The therapist said this was actually good for Jessica's recovery because it gave her a sense of taking back control. Jessica practiced her testimony with us too, and even though it was hard to hear the story again, we could see her getting stronger each time she told it. The bank investigator called Daniel with partial good news about the stolen money. They could recover about half of the $8,000 Ashley had taken, but the rest was gone forever. Ashley had been spending it on clothes and concerts and gifts for Chase, living a lifestyle we were unknowingly funding through our savings. The investigator said Ashley had been clever about it, taking small amounts over time so it wouldn't be noticed. The violation felt almost as bad as the attempted murder because we'd trusted Ashley completely, and she'd been robbing us the whole time. Daniel was furious that we'd been paying for Ashley to party, while we were saving every penny for Jessica's college. We'd probably never see that money again, even with restitution, because Ashley would be in prison for years. The local paper ran a story that week about teens who saved lives, and while they didn't use Georgia's name, they described a quick-thinking teenager who prevented a tragedy through clever intervention, and everyone knew it was about her. The article talked about how sometimes lying is justified when it saves a life, and praised the teenager's courage in doing something that would get her in trouble to protect someone else. Georgia cut out the article and pinned it to her bulletin board next to her drawings. Some kids at the school had seen the article and started being nicer to her, which helped a little bit. The principal even mentioned it in morning announcements, saying their school had a real hero among them, though he didn't say Georgia's name. She came home that day looking happier than she had in weeks, and said maybe things would get better now that people understood. I hugged her tight and told her she'd always be my hero no matter what anyone else thought. 3 weeks later, we sat in the courtroom for Ashley's pretrial hearing, and I kept my eyes on the back of her head where they'd cut her hair short in jail. The judge was an older woman who looked tired as she reviewed the bail reduction request, while Ashley stood between 2 guards in her orange jumpsuit. Her parents sat 2 rows behind us, and I could feel them staring at our backs the same way I was staring at their daughters. The prosecutor stood up and explained that Ashley was a flight risk, given the severity of the charges and the evidence against her. Ashley's lawyer argued she wasn't dangerous anymore since she didn't have access to drugs or Jessica. The judge looked through the papers for a long time before denying the request, and Ashley's shoulders dropped as the guards led her back out. Her mother started crying and her father helped her out of the courtroom without looking at us. I felt bad for them for about 2 seconds before remembering they'd raised someone who tried to kill my daughter. That same week, Jessica had been doing better, and Daniel made her a smoothie one morning while she was getting ready for her therapy appointment. She took one sip and immediately dropped the glass, which shattered all over the kitchen floor. She backed into the corner screaming and pulling at her hair while Daniel tried to calm her down. Her whole body was shaking, and she kept saying Ashley was in the house even though we knew she was still in jail. It took 20 minutes to get her breathing normal again, and she threw up twice from the panic. Her therapist said this was a major setback and added PTSD treatment to their sessions 3 times a week. Jessica couldn't eat or drink anything she didn't make herself, and started keeping her bedroom door locked even during the day. She'd check under her bed and in her closet multiple times before going to sleep. The school called us the next day to say they'd finished their investigation into Georgia's false accusation about Mr. Davidson. The principal met with us and explained that while lying about a teacher was serious, they understood Georgia had acted to save her sister's life. They updated their emergency policies to include situations where students might need to break rules to prevent harm. Georgia finally stopped looking so tense at the school and actually smiled when she got home that day. She'd been carrying around guilt about the lie for weeks, even though we kept telling her she did the right thing. The other kids had mostly stopped talking about it, which helped her feel more normal. 2 days later, the prosecutor called to say Chase had testified to the grand jury about Ashley's plan. He told them everything about how Ashley had been planning this for weeks, and asking him for drugs that would cause an overdose. He showed them texts where Ashley specifically asked for something that would make Jessica crash her car. The grand jury indicted Ashley for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and grand theft. The prosecutor said this meant the case would definitely go to trial unless Ashley accepted a reasonable plea deal. We'd have to prepare for months of legal proceedings, and Jessica would probably have to testify. Daniel hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. Jessica couldn't handle going back to the school after everything that happened, so we enrolled her in online classes to finish her senior year. She'd sit at her desk in her room with the door locked, doing her assignments on the computer. Her teachers were understanding about deadlines and let her turn things in late when she had bad days. She was determined not to let Ashley take her education away too, even though it was lonely doing school by herself. Sometimes I'd hear her on video calls with her teachers and she sounded so small and tired. She missed her friends but couldn't handle being around groups of people yet. The isolation was hard, but it was better than the panic attacks she'd have at the school. A week later, we got a thick envelope from Ashley's lawyer, and inside was a letter from Ashley asking us to drop the charges. She wrote that she'd been in jail for a month, and that was punishment enough for what she called a mistake. She said her life was ruined, and she'd learned her lesson and just wanted to move on. She never actually apologized or admitted what she'd really done. Daniel read it once, then tore it into tiny pieces and threw them in the trash without showing Jessica. Ashley's lawyer really sent a drop the charges letter calling attempted murder a mistake? That's like calling the Titanic a minor boating accident. The audacity is almost impressive if it wasn't so completely ridiculous. We weren't going to let Ashley manipulate us anymore, and the prosecutor had already warned us this might happen. Nyla called that afternoon to tell us about a support group for siblings of crime victims that met at the community center. Georgia didn't want to go at first, but we convinced her to try one meeting. She came back 2 hours later looking different somehow, like a weight had lifted off her shoulders. She met other kids who understood what it was like to watch their sibling almost die. One boy's brother had been stabbed by a friend over money, and a girl's sister had been pushed off a balcony by her boyfriend. They all carried the same kind of guilt about not doing enough or doing too much. Georgia started going every week and slowly began to process her trauma. The next week, Alina called us about plea negotiations with Ashley's lawyer. The prosecutor was offering 15 years with possibility of parole after 7 if Ashley pleaded guilty to attempted murder. Ashley's lawyer countered with involuntary manslaughter and 3 years, which Alina said was insulting given the evidence. They went back and forth for days with different offers while we waited anxiously for news. We told Alina we were prepared to go to trial if Ashley didn't accept real accountability for what she'd done. The negotiations dragged on with neither side wanting to give in. Jessica slowly started seeing friends again, but only one at a time and only in public places. She'd meet them at coffee shops, but always sat with her back to the wall watching everyone who came in. Her friends were patient and understanding, letting her pick the location and time. She couldn't handle anyone touching her food or drinks, so they'd wait for her to get her own order. These coffee dates were small steps, but they mattered. She was trying to rebuild some kind of normal life, even though nothing would ever be the same. 2 months after Ashley tried to kill her, we sat in another courtroom for another hearing. This time Ashley looked smaller somehow in her orange jumpsuit with her lawyer whispering in her ear. The judge asked if she understood the plea agreement, and Ashley said yes in a voice, so quiet we could barely hear it. She was pleading guilty to attempted murder and would get 12 years with the possibility of parole in 6 years. She also had to pay restitution for the stolen money, though we knew we'd probably never see most of it. The judge accepted the plea and set a sentencing date for the following month. The month passed in a blur of preparation meetings with Alina about what to expect at sentencing, and Jessica working on her victim impact statement with her therapist. When the day came, we sat in the same courtroom watching Ashley in her orange jumpsuit, while Jessica stood at the podium with her paper shaking in her hands. She started reading about how Ashley's betrayal had stolen her sense of safety and trust, how she couldn't eat or drink anything she didn't prepare herself, how she woke up every night thinking she was dying again on our kitchen floor. Her voice cracked when she described missing her best friend, even though that friend had tried to kill her, and I saw Ashley finally show emotion for the first time, tears running down her face as she heard the pain she'd caused. The judge listened carefully, then upheld the 12-year sentence, saying attempted murder by someone in a position of trust deserved serious consequences. 2 weeks later, we were back in court for Chase's sentencing, where he got 5 years as part of his plea deal for conspiracy and drug distribution. During his allocution, he admitted Ashley had been talking about killing Jessica for weeks before that morning, that she'd asked him specifically for drugs that would cause a car accident, that they'd planned together how to make it look accidental so no one would suspect murder. His testimony removed any last doubt about Ashley's intentions. Not that we had any, but hearing him describe their conversations made my stomach turn. After the legal proceedings ended, we started trying to rebuild something like normal life, though nothing would ever be the same. Daniel and I started couples counseling to work through our guilt about missing the warning signs, about the money disappearing, about trusting Ashley so completely that we nearly lost our daughter. The therapist helped us understand that predators like Ashley are good at manipulation, that we couldn't have known, but it still took months to stop blaming ourselves and each other for not protecting our daughters better. Meanwhile, Georgia got a letter saying she'd been accepted into an advanced summer program for students who'd shown exceptional judgment under pressure, specifically for teens who'd prevented crimes or saved lives. The program would teach emergency response skills and crisis management, and she'd spend 2 weeks at a special facility with other kids who'd been through similar experiences. Reading the acceptance letter, she finally smiled for real for the first time since that terrible morning, finally being recognized as the hero she was instead of the troublemaker everyone initially thought. Jessica decided during her recovery that she wanted to take her gap year working with a victim advocacy group instead of just deferring college and doing nothing. She applied to several organizations and got accepted by one that specifically wanted someone with lived experience of betrayal trauma to help counsel others going through similar situations. The coordinator said Jessica's story and her determination to help others made her exactly the kind of advocate they needed. Around the same time, the first restitution payment arrived from Ashley's prison work program, just $50, but it meant something to see her name on that check, proof that she was being held accountable even in a small way. We opened a new college fund for Jessica with better security measures, multiple signatures required for any withdrawals, regular audits, all the things we should have done before, but never imagined we'd need with someone we trusted like family. That same week, Mr. Davidson sent Georgia a recommendation letter for her high school applications, praising her quick thinking and moral courage in an impossible situation. He wrote that while nobody wants false accusations made about them, he understood she'd saved her sister's life and showed remarkable judgment under incredible pressure, that her willingness to sacrifice her own reputation to prevent a tragedy showed character beyond her years. Georgia cried reading it, finally having an adult besides us acknowledge that what she did was brave, not cruel. 6 months after that morning when Jessica almost died, we managed to have a family dinner where nobody checked their drinks or looked over their shoulders, where we could just eat and talk like a normal family again. We were different from before, more careful about who we let close, more aware of warning signs, but also closer to each other, bonded by surviving something terrible together. Jessica and Georgia had never been closer as sisters, the age gap that used to separate them erased by shared trauma and Georgia's heroism. Jessica got her college acceptance letter the next week for the following year, with a partial scholarship based on her advocacy work, ready to try again though she planned to live in a single room, and keep her circle small, having learned to protect herself while still moving forward with her life. When Georgia started high school that fall, she had a reputation as someone brave who stood up for others, and she joined the peer counseling program to help other students deal with difficult situations. Her experience, as traumatic as it was, had given her wisdom beyond her years, and the ability to spot danger that others might miss. 3 weeks later, I was pushing my cart through the frozen food aisle when I spotted 2 familiar figures by the ice cream. Ashley's parents stood there staring at the Ben & Jerry's like it held answers to questions they couldn't ask. Her mom's hand shook as she reached for a pint, then pulled back. I tried to turn my cart around, but the wheel stuck and made that awful squeaking noise. They both looked up at the same time. Her dad's face went through about 5 different expressions before landing on something between shame and determination. They walked toward us and I felt my whole body tense up. Her mom spoke first, saying they were sorry for what Ashley did, and thanking us for not pushing for the maximum sentence. Her dad added that they knew we could have made things worse for her, but we showed mercy. I just nodded because what else could I say? Nothing they said would fix Jessica's nightmares, or give back the trust we lost. 2 months after that, on our 20th anniversary, Daniel surprised me by having the girls help him set up a small ceremony in our backyard. He'd written new vows about paying attention to warning signs and trusting each other's instincts. I promised to speak up when something felt wrong instead of staying quiet to keep the peace. Jessica held the rings even though her hands shook a little. Georgia read a poem she'd written about family being the people who save you when you can't save yourself. We all cried, but it was the good kind of crying. Around that same time, Jessica met someone at her victim advocacy group meetings. He was there because his brother had been hurt by someone they trusted too. She told me about him slowly over weeks, testing how it felt to say his name out loud. They started getting coffee after meetings, always sitting where Jessica could see the door. He knew her whole story and never pushed for more than she could give. I watched her learn to smile again when his name showed up on her phone. The police department called Georgia in early spring, asking if she'd speak at their youth safety event. She practiced her speech for weeks in front of the mirror, then in front of us, then in front of her stuffed animals when we weren't home. Georgia getting recognition for preventing a crime while everyone first thought she was making trouble? That's quite the turnaround from how these things usually go when teens report something serious. The day of the event, she wore her best dress and kept smoothing down the wrinkles. She told the audience of kids and parents about trusting your gut, even when adults don't believe you. She explained how sometimes doing the wrong thing, like lying, is actually doing the right thing if it saves someone. The room was dead quiet when she finished, then erupted in applause. A year after that terrible morning, I helped Jessica polish her college application essays. She'd written about finding purpose in pain and turning trauma into action to help others. Her grades had recovered, and her advocacy work gave her something powerful to write about. The acceptance letters started coming in March. She got into 5 schools and chose one 3 hours away. Far enough for a fresh start, but close enough to come home when the nightmares got bad. We celebrated quietly with cake and Jessica's favorite Chinese takeout. Georgia got mail a few days later from a girl in another state who'd seen a news story about our family. The girl wrote that her friend had been drugging her drinks at parties, and she'd been too scared to tell anyone until she heard about Georgia saving Jessica. She said Georgia's courage gave her permission to speak up, and now her friend was facing charges too. Georgia kept that letter in a special box under her bed with the newspaper clipping about her heroism. When summer came, we booked a simple beach house for a week, our first real vacation since everything happened. Jessica was nervous about being away from her therapist, but we promised to drive home immediately if she needed to. Georgia packed 3 bottles of sunscreen and a first aid kit because she'd become protective about safety. We spent the days building sandcastles and jumping waves. Jessica and Georgia would race to see who could run fastest from the tide coming in. Daniel taught them both to body surf while I took about 1,000 pictures. There were whole hours where we forgot about trials and lawyers and therapy appointments. On our last evening, I sat on the beach watching my daughters chase ghost crabs with flashlights. Jessica was laughing so hard she couldn't run straight, and Georgia kept trying to catch them in a bucket to look at before letting them go. Daniel brought me a cup of coffee and we sat there watching our girls be kids again. The truth was, we were all different now, marked by what happened in ways that would never fully fade. Jessica still checked her drinks, and Georgia still watched for danger everywhere. Daniel and I had learned to pay attention to our instincts and speak up when something felt off. We'd survived something that should have destroyed us and came out the other side still standing, still together, still fighting for each other every single day. Time to close this chapter of our commentary adventures. Appreciate you letting me be your witty sidekick through all the twists and turns. Like the video, it helps more than you think.